Hello everyone and welcome to the webinar. My name is Keith Wojcieszek. I'm Global Head of Threat Intelligence for Kroll and based in Washington, DC. I've been with Kroll for almost 7 years now, and prior to this I used to work for the US Secret Service, where I was able to have the opportunity to lead the service's cyber threat intelligence program. Today is February 21st, which is National Sticky Buns Day. So Sticky Buns Day, sticky buns are believed to have been introduced into America by German settlers in Philly during the 18th century, becoming one of the most amazing experiences we know today. So they are the glue that holds my happiness together. I hope they are for you as well. So happy National Sticky Buns Day. I am delighted to be able to speak with all of you today. At Kroll, we're always looking to provide thoughtful insight and great value to our clients to help them defend the organization against the latest cyber threats and really improve their cyber maturity. But before I get started, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. Today's session will be recorded and will be available after the briefing. We're using GoToWebinar for the presentation, and you'll find the client on your monitor. Through that client, you'll be able to submit questions at any time, and the presenters will address your questions at the end. So please ask questions. We will answer them online as well as during the briefing. So a little background on Kroll. We've carried out about just over 3,000 engagements in 2023. Today, we'll be taking a look at the current trends that our threat intelligence team has collected and highlighting what we've seen during the final quarter of 2023 and the year in review. So Kroll is in a unique position to deliver end-to-end cybersecurity solutions across several different service lines. We have a wealth of over 650 cybersecurity experts on the Kroll team who are working around the globe with companies of many sizes, varieties of industries, and we work with over 85 cyber insurance carriers. This gives us tremendous visibility into what's going on the front lines. So in this session, we're going to cover the cyber threat landscape with a focus in Q4 and 2023 as a whole. So looking at some stats that we have, we've seen an 8% increase in attacks against the professional services sector in 2023 compared to 2022, which still remains the top impacted sector for the year. We also saw a 6% increase in email compromise attacks, remaining the top threat incident type. Ransomware also increased in Q4 compared to Q3. Additionally, in 2023, we saw a rise in threat actors leveraging external remote services as the initial access method during the ransomware attacks. So the team will dive deeper into this later in the presentation and give you further detail. So we are very fortunate to have leading Kroll experts join us today to go into more detail and provide their expert analysis. We're joined by Laurie Iacono and George Glass. So Laurie, George, can you spend a few minutes introducing yourselves?
Sure, I'll go first. So my name is Laurie Iacono. I'm an associate managing director on our cyber threat intel team. I've been with Kroll for 5 years, and my team specializes in kind of reactive intelligence for our incident responders. So we come in after an event's happened. We're either informing them about the threat actor or doing dark web monitoring, so looking for potential leakage of data. And prior to Kroll, I was at an information sharing organization called the National Cyber Forensics Training Alliance, or the NCFTA, and I was there for about 5 years, and I worked very closely with private industry and law enforcement on building cases against cyber criminals.
Hey everyone, my name's George. I'm a senior vice president in the CTI team. My main responsibility is looking after the managed detection and response side of the house, ensuring we have good detection and capability to respond to new and novel cyber threats, a lot of malware analysis, a lot of vulnerability analysis, as we'll get on to today. I'll hand back to Keith.
George, Laurie, thank you so much. We are very fortunate to have you guys here and provide some insights. So Laurie, I know we're going to look at a lot of numbers today. It's going to be stats from this, stats from that. Can you give us some background on how we get to the data that we'll be looking at today?
Yeah, so, for those of you who have joined our quarterly sessions before, we look at a lot of graphs throughout the sessions. And all of those graphs that you're going to see this morning or this afternoon, they're all data from our incident response cases. So this is an incident where a company or an organization, some kind of activity has occurred and they have engaged with Kroll to investigate that and determine what happened. Now, obviously the graphs, numbers don't always tell the full picture, right? So what we try to do with those graphs is, even though those graphs, like I said, that's what we see, our particular view, we overlay that with what we're seeing in other open source intelligence from the wider threat research community, and we're also overlaying that with what we're seeing in the dark web forums and marketplaces, and that kind of helps us set our themes that we go over in each quarterly section, because like I said, we want that to be reflective of the bigger picture.
Yeah, thanks, Laurie. So basically, we have this huge holistic view with a bit of a splash and flavor of Kroll's expert analysis, which is awesome. So thank you for that. Similar to other sessions, the first thing we're going to look at is the general landscape that Kroll saw in Q4 with respect to the sectors and threat incident types. Can you tell us what we're seeing as it's related to the sectors?
Yeah, so with sectors, the first slide we're going to look at here, this is looking at our top 5 sectors, and you can see here the top 5 was for 2023, and then we have the year-over-year changes from 2022 for those top 5 sectors. You can see here that professional services, this was also our #1 ranked sector last year, and this year we did have some increases in targeting of that sector. We had previously covered that in some of the earlier quarterly reports. We reported in January, February of 2023 about some specific malware campaigns related to bootloader malware that were targeting law firms. We've had a couple other campaigns specific to professional services in 2023 that we think impacted those numbers. Now, we also saw, again, we saw a slight uptick in activity around manufacturing. This, again, unfortunately, is a very attractive sector for threat actors. And again, this was one that we had covered in our last quarterly report. I do want to look here, we're going to kind of drill into each of these sectors throughout today's session, but I want to note healthcare, because although the overall numbers went down, if you're looking at the year-over-year view, we did see an uptick, unfortunately, in attacks targeting the healthcare sector in the last quarter of 2023, and a lot of that was around hospitals, and it did seem to be very, unfortunately, ransomware focused. So we did see that at the end of last year. Now, I also want to look, I said we're going to talk a little bit about each sector. Now, with financial services, this tends to be one that is typically in our top 5, but this year we saw something a little different with financial services. Typically, we see with that sector, the things that we see related to it are email compromise, insider threat, unauthorized access. But as I said, we saw some different things this year. So George, can you tell us a little bit about what we were seeing with financial services last year?
Yeah, absolutely. Financial services usually associated with having a fair amount of money, the ability to pay for the best in class defensive technologies, great people. And so what we saw last year was a bit of a sort of a divergence, as you say, towards attacks that affected these organizations because of the type of software that they're running, or because their partners are running certain types of software. 2023, KLOP specifically targeted managed file sharing platforms like MoveIt and Go Anywhere, because those platforms contain sensitive data, and breaches of those platforms have a pretty big splash damage. I think one of the most interesting things about KLOP's targeting of those platforms is, and we've got some coverage of this, is their capability to develop zero-day exploit and deploy that exploit in an automated fashion over a single holiday weekend. That's the stuff of sort of advanced persistent threat nation state sponsored groups. But that's what we saw last year, and I think that's affected numbers pretty significantly.
So George, that's actually a good segue into the next one I want to cover, which is technology, telecom, and hardware. And you mentioned specifically a couple different technologies. You mentioned MoveIt and Go Anywhere. And, coming into 2024, we've unfortunately been seeing, it was a top sector last year, and unfortunately coming into 2024, it seems like it might be another top sector for threat actors. So can you talk a little bit about some of the news that we're following in the current quarter?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the most interesting things at the beginning of this year is just how many highly impactful sort of CVSS 9 and above vulnerabilities we've already been covering. We've also seen some pretty significant supply chain breaches. Microsoft has had some incidents towards the end of last year and early this year. We've seen AnyDesk with a breach. Lots of people, organizations use AnyDesk, and other popular services like Fortinet, Ivanti, and all of those could obviously have pretty significant impact on the software supply chain. There is another really significant vulnerability that I think directly impacts that particular sector. That was a CVSS 10 vulnerability in GitLab. That allows threat actors to essentially reset any user's account password. So obviously it follows that actors could be using that vulnerability to steal source code, inject malicious code into source code, which many organizations rely on, third-party open source code. Pretty much all of that's to play for. So yeah, it's already been a really interesting start to the year.
Yeah, so unfortunately, it's been very impactful for that particular sector. Now, next, I want to look at kind of drilling into threat incident types that we were seeing. And we're going to look at, again, we're going to look at a year-over-year view. And you can see here that we have, we have some increases, as Keith mentioned earlier, with email compromise. We have some decreases in specifically in our overall percentage of cases related to ransomware, unauthorized access, as well as web compromise. Now, if you were on the last quarterly report, I mentioned that we had seen a decline in ransomware in the third quarter, and I was predicting that maybe we would see an uptick of that in the fourth quarter. That's kind of based on what we see every year, these seasonal ebbs and flows. And we did see that again in 2023. We did see an increase in ransomware in the last quarter. And the interesting thing with ransomware that people might look at here is, okay, well, the numbers are down, right? So does that mean that the threat index is lower, or that you should lower your concern about ransomware? And even though we did see a year-over-year decrease, as I said, in our percentage of ransomware cases, I would never tell organizations to lower their threat level when it comes to ransomware. And, unfortunately, there were also some reports last year that there were record profits for the ransomware group. So it was a record-breaking year for them gaining profits. So even though, particularly this week, we're seeing some major disruptions in the ransomware community, which we're going to talk about later. But because we know it is so profitable, we think it's highly likely that they will continue doing this in some way, shape, or form. Another thing with respects to ransomware is that even though we've seen lower incidents, we're seeing the cases that we're seeing seem to be having a higher impact. So, as George mentioned earlier with the Klopp case, that affected a lot of organizations that didn't necessarily have MoveIt, right? They were impacted because their data was posted on the site. And we're seeing more and more organizations coming to us, and they maybe didn't experience a ransomware themselves, but they were affected by it because maybe they're, they were a client, or they worked with one of these parties that were impacted, and now their customers' data or their R&D proprietary data was posted on this site. And then lately, we've been seeing in a lot of our incident response cases related to ransomware, we've been seeing more aggressive campaigns. So things like more data being exfiltrated. So think in the tunes of, not gigabytes, but terabytes. We're seeing actors going after backups. So, that's one way. If they're going after those backups, that makes it harder for a company to restore in the wake of an attack. And then recently, we've been seeing a rise in re-extortion attempts post-incident. So a company may think that they're done with this ransomware event and they can put it to rest, and then a threat actor reaches out, or a different threat actor reaches out. Now they claim to have data and they're trying to extort them. So we've been seeing a lot of chaos in that landscape recently. And George, I know you've been following, I was kind of talking about what we've been seeing in our cases, but I know you've been following a lot of the major ransomware news stories of this year. Can you kind of speak to the impact of some of those that we've seen?
Yeah, I think especially towards the end of last year, the operational impact of a lot of these ransomware attacks seemed to be pretty high. Unfortunately, we saw a number of attacks against organizations where any stop in their operations is immediately impactful. They're losing money essentially immediately. So we saw some high impact attacks against some casinos, entertainment companies. And I think one of the most interesting is the attacks on operational technology in auto manufacturers, because automotive operate just-in-time production schedules. Threat actors know that if they shut down their operational technology, just the fact that those JIT platforms have to be restored and recovered, all of that time taken to do that, understanding the incident and responding to it is essentially burning money. And so that really does put a greater onus on the impacted organization to be able to recover much more quickly, and potentially they're more willing to pay the threat actors just to make the pain go away.
So that's actually a good segue. I know, some of those notable attacks were by groups like Black Cat. We've heard, we're going to talk a lot about Lockbit, but we've seen a lot of activity with different variants this year. So it's a good segue into our next section, where we're going to look specifically at ransomware and some of the variants that we saw being the most active in the last quarter of last year. So we saw, in our cases, Lockbit was the number one most active. And it's interesting though, because even though it was the number one most active, it was actually less active in the fourth quarter in our numbers than it had been in the third quarter. And we saw the same thing around Black Cat ransomware. And it's kind of interesting. I know specifically with Black Cat, we've kind of attributed, perhaps some of that ebb with their activity related to some disruption that happened in December last year where their site was seized. Unfortunately, with Black Cat, they were able to restore fairly quickly, and they are still posting, as of today, they are still unfortunately posting victims on their website. Now with Lockbit, it was just a couple days ago that we found out about the disruption to Lockbit, and I'm still taking in all the news on it. It seems to be, probably one of the most comprehensive ransomware disruptions that we've seen to date. And Lockbit was also one of the longest standing ones, that they were active since about 2019. Keith, I know, you're following this law enforcement activity, you're former law enforcement. Was there anything you wanted to add in there about this current activity?
Yeah, first I want to say it was a great thing that law enforcement did collaborated together and took this down from NCA, FBI, all these different countries actually took down Lockbit. Now, that's awesome, right? On the surface, that's amazing. One thing we got to consider that these guys are smart. So some sources I have that are pretty close to some of this stuff tell me the first thing they do is they go for the backups, right? Like you said, Laurie, earlier. Another thing that Lockbit and these ransomware groups have, they understand that, right? So they're backing up themselves. So though it's awesome they took everything down, they're disrupting it, the shift from the data is still going to be there. They're backing it up. Unless law enforcement has obtained access to that backup and all those victims, it's still going to be there. Ransomware groups do that. They're experts in their field. This is a business, right? They know how to make money, and that's the overall goal, right? Is the financial gain. So they're going to take that into consideration. And like I said, some of the sources that I talked to are really big into understanding the concept of how to attack someone and then how to prevent it as well. So they're doing cybersecurity measures just as we are.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And if you study threat actors, you do see that quite a lot where they are using, basic cybersecurity controls. They're also really good at information sharing. So it kind of exactly what we're doing today. We definitely see threat actors doing that on the maybe not on webinars, but maybe on forums. But
there needs to be webinars, right? We
the
need to have
principle is the same. Yeah, maybe they do have webinars. I don't know. We haven't been invited.
They have marketing campaigns.
Not yet. So, it's interesting. So we have that activity with these larger players, right? And it's kind of like what happens after that. There's always some kind of a ripple effect after a disruption. So we're going to be monitoring that very closely as it relates to Lockbit. But particularly starting in the fourth quarter last year, we did start to see some shifts. And some of those shifts were around, we were seeing more activity with groups like Akira and Play, which we're going to talk about at length in the next section. We're going to go through some case studies there. And we also saw some more activity with Cactus. And Cactus was a group that we first reported on. That was one of our analysts at Kroll, was kind of the first one to identify that as something new and start reporting on that. We published that, I think, in April or May last year. And George, I know you've been following that one, and there's been a lot of evolution with that group in the last few months. Can you kind of talk us through that?
Yeah, Cactus are an interesting group of threat actors, clearly very technically adept. And when we first saw them, they were exploiting Fortinet VPNs with known vulnerabilities. But since then, actors that have deployed Cactus have been seen using a wide variety of other techniques, malvertising, which we've covered quite a lot, to deliver various malwares, including Danabot. They've also exploited other vulnerabilities in SaaS solutions to gain initial access. And so, yeah, I think especially with a lot of these takedowns, we're going to see previous affiliates from other groups, potentially being recruited into these ones. And those groups can really only benefit from that sort of thing. There's less competition in the threat actor marketplace, essentially. So we're going to keep a really close eye on these guys.
Yeah, so you mentioned, initial access methods there and how we've kind of seen that evolve with respects to Cactus. And we see that with a lot of group because they do use that affiliate model that, there's multiple different ways that they might try to get in. But that's a nice transition to our next section here, because we are going to drill in specifically to initial access methods and what we were seeing. So the first slide that we're going to be looking at, you can see here that phishing was the top initial access method that we were seeing reported in our cases at Kroll, and that held true. That was also the same in 2022. So we still see phishing. Unfortunately, it still happens because it works, right? People might be very surprised at that, but part of the reason for it working is because the threat actors that conduct these kind of campaigns are always evolving their tactics. So they know what we're being trained on in the legitimate business side. Hey, watch out for this. And then they're coming up with the next thing that we haven't trained people on. So George, I know you follow the phishing campaigns quite closely. So can you tell us a little bit about the evolutions you saw last year?
Yeah, 2023 was a really interesting year in the sort of the malware market. There were some pretty significant changes made by Microsoft to how the mark of the web works. That directly impacted threat actors' ability to sort of sneak VBA macro code into Word documents and Excel files, things that make really good lures for these sorts of things. And so over the year, we saw a pretty interesting branch of new and novel techniques. We saw the use of OneNote files, which initially weren't directly impacted by those mark of the web changes. And then we started to see threat actors bundle malware with ISO files, password protected zips, using living off the land binaries bundled into those things, all of which designed to bypass mark of the web checks, bypass inline defensive technologies. All of that is a really great way of delivering malware. And we also saw a change in the way that threat actors look to harvest credentials from phishing, right? Detection has improved and come a long way. People's ability to spot a phishing email, I think, on the whole, has probably improved. But threat actors are always looking for ways of bypassing that. And tools like Evil Engine X2, Well, Evil Proxy, all of these actor in the middle frameworks, which are designed to harvest credentials gather multi-factor authentication requests and forward those requests onto the service that they're designed to phish for, saw a pretty big increase in 2023. We see that all the time now, and those tokens can live for sometimes up to 90 days, sometimes indefinitely. And we saw a lot of these being delivered using QR code phishing, and we've got some articles on QR code phishing. Some people may call it quishing. That's the last time you'll ever hear me say that. The QR code phishing specifically, we saw a lot, especially in Q4 of last year. There's an example there, redacted on the bottom left-hand side of the screen there. And what is that designed to do? Well, the first thing you do when you see a QR code is you go to scan it with your phone. That, as a victim, immediately removes you from a corporate-controlled device or network. And of course, that's also the place that you have your multi-factor authenticator and things like that. It just really streamlines the ability for threat actors to collect those credentials that they're after, collect that MFA token, forward it onto the service, and then resell that access at a later time. So yeah, really interesting changes to the phishing landscape last year.
Thank you for that. So yeah, those QR codes, that's funny. I was at a networking event recently and I couldn't believe everyone was just like had their phone out like with QR codes adding each other. And I guess as the security professional there, I was very concerned with all those QR codes going around.
It's addictive. You have to do it. It's so addictive to just go up there.
Yeah.
What is
So hopefully no one pulled their phone out to scan that QR code. But so we're looking here on this graph, we're looking at initial access across all of our Kroll cases. Now, one thing you may notice here is that we actually saw a decline overall in external remote services. So some of you may be wondering, well, why is Kroll focusing on external remote services for the briefing today if they saw a decline in it? And the next slide, if we flip over there, that's kind of shows a good reason why we are focusing on it today. So I mentioned earlier, when we look at ransomware cases, we do find those to be the most impactful, unfortunately, for clients. And that is where this slide here is looking at initial access specifically by ransomware cases. And you can see by far for those cases, those methods to get in time and time again in our forensic investigations, they unfortunately trace back to either open RDP or a threat actor potentially accessing a virtual private network or VPN. In some cases, they're doing that with valid accounts where there's no MFA that's enforced on that. So they're able, couple those accounts from the dark web or from an info stealer, and they're able, unfortunately, to get right into the network. Another thing with remote services that's probably driving this number up is that we've seen a lot of, unfortunately, significant vulnerabilities related to those appliances and various software in the past few months. So George, can you tell us about some of the ones that you're following or some of the specifically critical CVEs that are related to these VPNs?
Yeah, there is, I don't even know the number, but a lot of very impactful vulnerabilities towards the end of last year especially. We saw a lot of zero-day vulnerabilities or end-day vulnerabilities being exploited very quickly after initial disclosure. So for those 0 days, typically there was one group exploiting it, it got reported, and then others were quickly able to copy some exploit code or produce a POC very quickly, and then they were very quick to leverage that. We saw that used against Fortinet VPNs. Of course, the Citrix Bleed suite of vulnerabilities. Many of the groups that we've been talking about today had sort of initial access task forces, which were, just going around owning as many of those devices as possible, and then giving that access onto ransomware operators who could take that initial access and move laterally. And we also had some very significant vulnerabilities affecting Cisco products as well. Cisco iOS, which impacted tens of thousands of devices, and ASA appliances as well. So yeah, for a threat actor, there's a lot of exploit code to choose from and a lot of surface to attack.
Yeah, and like you said, a lot of times when there are these CVEs and the VPN, sometimes it is kind of like open season. for the ransomware groups, where they're just specifically targeting those at a high volume. So we're going to get into some case studies now. In both of our case studies, they start with that as the initial access is, something related to the VPN. And the first one I'm going to walk through here is Akira ransomware. So this is one that we started seeing an increase in Akira in Q4. Unfortunately, we've continued to see that in Q1, so this still seems to be some active campaigns. And they do seem to be targeting VPNs that aren't enforcing multi-factor authentication. And also, it seems to be focused on the Cisco ASA devices, which there is a CVE that is connected to those ones, I think, that was published in October. And that seems to be what this group is targeting. So in this particular case, once the actor got in through the VPN, the actor was able to maintain persistence via a remote management monitoring tool. In this case, it was AnyDesk. So they were using legitimate tools to maintain persistence. And they conducted some internal network discovery using NetScan. In this case, in all the cases that we've observed with Akira, there has been some element of data exfiltration. And in those cases, they have been using WinSCP for that exfil and also WinRAR for compression. We also see they are leveraging a remote desktop protocol, or RDP, to move laterally across systems. And once they have escalated their privileges to domain admin level privileges, they are then deploying Akira ransomware. And we've seen, as I said, we've seen a lot of cases with Akira, and they all seem to follow this similar fact pattern. And we're also following a lot of reporting from other IR companies that are reporting the same activity. And I do believe that CISA actually put out a warning about that this week, specifically related to that Cisco ASA vulnerability that I mentioned. So, I kind of walked through this one at a high level, and I'm going to have George now walk through it as well. So, we always talk about initial access, and initial access, we want to keep actors out. So we want to lock the door, we want to lock all the windows so intruders can't get into our homes, right? And it's the same thing for our networks. But unfortunately, sometimes in spite of the best security controls, actors still get in. So what I want to do now is kind of look at these, look at this case study and look at the, all the things that they did here and where we have some opportunities to detect this activity and stop it before it gets to that ultimate payload. So George is kind of gonna walk us through that for the Akira one, and then we're gonna do the same for our next case study on play.
Sure, thanks, Laurie. Yeah, defense in depth is always a good strategy, especially when it comes to novel or zero-day vulnerabilities where a detection may be days, weeks, or very hard to do. And so it's best to have those layers of defense, right? So let's take a look at initially with what visibility that we can gain into our environment, just to give everyone some ideas of areas of the network that they can be looking. Of course, we can gather logs from our edge networking technologies. I think that's what most organizations do, and that can be used to drive some level of observability. Of course, those endpoints are a great way of driving detection, and we'll go into some of that in a minute. Of course, we've got the use of RDP there. That's a great network log source that we can get into a SIEM and use that to drive detection. And we've also got the threat actors using domain admin level privileges. So that's typically what should be used as a break glass account. So the fact that domain admin had been used immediately should be setting off some bells and whistles, some red flags there. So let's look at some places that we can detect and respond to this activity. What can we use to drive the detection? Well, of course, we've got our endpoint monitoring tools like EDR, next generation antivirus. If you don't use AnyDesk in your environment, for example, immediately that should be triggering alerts. Internal network discovery, just the dropping of the NetScan binary, all of those things can be alerted on with some pretty high confidence. Moving into areas where we might be getting a few more alerts and a few false positives. Again, the use of RDP, looking at that network traffic, and of course the use of domain admin as well. And let's take a look at some of the controls that we can put in place. Again, applications like AnyDesk, totally legitimate application. You may use it in your environment, but if you don't, employ application whitelisting. Make it so that it's hard for the threat actors to drop that binary onto the endpoint. Similarly, for the use of WinSCP and WinRAR, data exfiltration outside of the network as well, that can all be tightened up. And if you don't use RDP in your day-to-day activities in your organization, maybe consider disabling RDP or severely limiting the ability for normal users to use it. Yeah, just some ideas there. I'll hand back to you, Laurie.
Okay, and thanks for that. And we're going to look at another case study here. And, it's a different ransomware group. So now we have play, but you're going to see a lot of similarities between the two. So a lot of the things that George just mentioned would also apply in this particular case for detection. Now, in this one, they were leveraging the Citrix Bleed vulnerability to get into the network. Once they were in, this time they were, conducting internal scouting. So they were using a series of different commands to discover and enumerate accounts on the network. This time they used PowerShell to deploy tools. They were deploying things like Mimikatz to help them obtain credentials for lateral movement. And in this case, instead of using a legitimate tool like AnyDesk for persistence, they actually had a remote access Trojan that they were using. And they were also using defense evasion techniques by clearing logs, stopping backups, and exchange services. Exfiltration occurred the same way as in the last, as did lateral movement via RDP. And then in this one, the ultimate payload was a play ransomware payload that was distributed via group policy objects across multiple hosts. So George, I know you already touched on the detection for some of these things, but can you take us through some different areas that were affected in this case that we might be able to detect for?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, let's look at where we can get some visibility. A lot of this is going to be very much the same, where we've got endpoint devices. So we need to get visibility of the network, endpoint, any of our tooling that we may be using, Citrix in this particular case. Again, we've got RDP as well. If we take a look at what areas we can detect and respond on, again, the use of PowerShell, Mimikatz, immediately that should be triggering an alert. It should be investigated, identified where that alert has started. All of that stuff can be driven from really good endpoint detection response tools. The use of a remote access Trojan in any way, you would hope antivirus would be able to step in some of those places. But if not, understanding the particular Trojan that's being used, some of the MITRE TTPs that particular piece of malware has to do to operate effectively, and detect on those, again, is a really good idea. And of course, we've got the use of RDP as well. And when it comes to controls, again, we're looking really at application allow listing. We're looking at the use of RDP here. That's something that most organizations probably do use, but in a limited sense, and so can be stopped there. And of course, exfiltration of data. If that's not a control, it can certainly be an alert. If large quantities of data are leaving your network from somewhere you don't expect, then that needs to be investigated. Back over to you, Laurie.
Yeah, so George, you were talking us through like all these different alerts that might fire off, and I know you've mentioned sometimes, with some of these alerts, it can create a lot of noise. There could be false positives. So I was actually wondering if you could kind of speak to, I know this is a problem we all have in threat intel, but can you kind of speak to what organizations can do about alert fatigue?
Yeah, alert fatigue, I think it affects everyone, right? Sort of 1,000-yard stare to the time I spent in the SOC. It can be very difficult to filter the signal from the noise. I think the main sort of tips would be to ensure high quality detection, that the detection describes exactly what it's designed to detect and why that's malicious, and that information is communicated clearly to the SOC operators, and to constantly tune those detections to make it as tight as possible, right? We've all been guilty of setting off 50,000 alerts over a weekend with a new detection, right? So that's something that should be a constant ongoing process.
Okay, yeah, it's always a issue of tuning and training all of our programs for that, right? So I think the final section that we're going to touch on specifically is going to go into malware. So looking at some of those info stealers that sometimes are the precursors to ransomware. But George, why don't you tell us about what we're seeing with malware right now?
Sure. Yeah, these trends, just like some of our other data, comes from what we're seeing internally, and we blend that with stuff that we're picking up from our C2 scanning and what open source reporting there is. I think there's two sort of main takeaways from this. Firstly, QAKBOT. It's way down on the list. It wouldn't be a briefing with me unless I mentioned QAKBOT at least once. And the threat actor behind it, of course, suffered a pretty significant setback towards the sort of, I think, August, September of last year when QAKBOT was disrupted. Well, what we're seeing now is an attempt to kind of revive QAKBOT, but also moving to other malware strains. And one of those that this particular threat actor has chosen, we track them as KTA248, also known as TA577, has chosen PeekaBot to be one of their sort of initial access malwares of choice. So we saw a lot of that in Q4 of last year. And then I think, as you touched on, Laurie, quite a few of these malwares now in our top 10 are info stealer malwares. And that's something that is that's really interesting. There was a pretty big change up in how info stealers were operated towards the end of last year. Of course, info stealers make up a huge part of the initial access brokership market, as we've been talking about today. But I think one of the most interesting things is they're not particularly targeted. We've seen threat actors drop them as part of their engagements to get credentials from inside a network, but otherwise they're designed to target as many people as possible. That could be victims that are using their home PCs. Of course, those people may reuse or save corporate credentials onto their on their home devices as well, which makes it, again, really tricky thing to be able to detect and respond to that. And really, you need to sort of wait until those credentials appear on something like the Russian market, which you can see here. And I know, Laurie, you guys do a lot of work investigating those sorts of logs. So I'll hand back over to you to talk about that in a bit more detail.
Yeah, so this screenshot here that we have on the slide, this is actually from Russian market, and that's one of the dark web shops where they sell credentials like this. So when data is stolen from an info stealer, a lot of times those logs end up on a market like Russian market. And you can see, the listings there, they listed actually by the info stealer, and then what you purchase as an end user, if you're purchasing the listing, is you're getting basically the saved passwords, sometimes the cookies, the usernames for every single credential that user may have logged into on that device. So we see this a lot, unfortunately, in our dark web monitoring. We see organizations, their domains matching in these marketplaces. And a lot of times it may be customers that are being affected there. So it's not necessarily an organizational risk. But sometimes, we do come through those, and what we are more concerned about is what George mentioned, those where they may have, maybe they're using bring your own device or something like that. So they are logging into a part of the network on their personal device. And now there's the potential that threat actor could purchase that listing and have access to those credentials, which feeds back into what we talked about earlier with valid accounts. Now you have, they have valid accounts, and then if we don't have MFA enforced or things like that, it could make it very easy for them, unfortunately, to get into the system. So I know we have went through a lot of information here. So I know we're coming up on the end, but Keith, why don't you take us through a summary of what we discussed today?
Yeah, well, and before we do that, I think it's really important. The last time we're talking about Russian market, don't take that lightly, because we have seen cases where credentials have gotten in and they move laterally, even with defenses that are put in place. So it's I think looking at dark web monitor, something you can do to identify if any of your stuff is on these marketplaces is vital to success. And talk about the summary, I think it's really important to understand that it is. They're stealing everything, right? It's like them coming in. So don't take that lightly. So looking at the summary, Kroll has seen a study of targeting of the professional services industry, has been the top impacted sector for each quarter in 2023, and it's definitely going to continue to 2024. We've also seen a spike in supply chain attacks. So we need to continue to monitor this activity, and we will. We'll let you guys know. We observed an increase in threat actors targeting external remote services as their initial access method during ransomware attacks, and really any attacks. And George talked about that earlier. January was really kind of crazy with 0 days specifically. We've seen many consistencies in activity across many different ransomware variants. And this last one, train, but phishing remains a top threat as actors continue to evolve their techniques to lure victims using their the QR codes, whatever they're doing it, right? They're getting themselves in there. So with that, what actions can we take? When it comes to protecting your data, remember the wise words of Keith Wojcieszek: is that stay classy and stay secure. But George, Laurie, I'm going to have you talk about specifics.
Yeah, so some actions that organizations can take, I'll keep beating on the drum of this, enforcing that multi-factor authentication for VPN access. That is very important, as well as prioritize patching for vulnerabilities that are impacting any VPN appliances. I'll also give a plug. I know we have our written report for this session is being published on our website today. I think Keith's going to give specifics on that later, but we do have a little more details on actions in that report, so I would encourage everyone to visit that as well.
Yeah, just to round it off, hardening VPN and edge networking technologies, hardening that as much as possible. Can you put the endpoint behind SSO? Anything like that can significantly slow down threat actors. And perform regular attack simulations to detect exactly these sorts of weaknesses, right? It's very, very important to continually run that red team and understand where your capability to detect and respond ends. With that, I'll hand back to Keith.
Yeah, we're running out of time. I know it's 45 minutes, we're a little over, but there are a couple things that I think we should address here. There's a couple questions that some are really good. One of them was, and George, this may be good for you, is the vulnerabilities appearing so often. We're getting these daily. How do you prioritize them? What are you doing? How do you step from, hey, this is the 10, and maybe 10 for me, but it's not 10 for someone else? Like, how do you prioritize them?
Yeah, I think that really does come down to understanding the threat landscape, how threat actors are exploiting those vulnerabilities. When we do our assessments, we try to realize, hey, we've seen a similar vulnerability to this used to exploit and run ransomware campaigns and things like that. So it really comes down to what access does it give the attacker? How could they exploit that access, and how easy is that to do? Has the vulnerability been weaponized? Is there code out on the internet that lowers that barrier to entry for any threat actor to exploit it?
Yeah, and I'll say thank you very much. It's tough, right? It's all really dependent on what you're looking at. But there's one more that just came in, and I think that, George, we had talked about this before, about token theft, right? And finding info stealers and token theft. Can you talk briefly about stealing the token? And I think this one is not up, it's here, right? It's here now, but I think it's really causing a stir. If you don't mind kind of giving an overview on that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that, especially in Q4 of last year, InfoSteal has really switched to targeting these cookies and these tokens. Essentially, what it allows a threat actor to do is just take that token, stick it in their web browser, and essentially become that person. And some of those tokens live, some of them perpetually, across password resets. It has to be actually revoked. And so, hey, you need to know that your credentials have been stolen in order to revoke that, right? So that particular method of access is very powerful, especially for things that are sort of designed for SSO and sort of streamlining user experience. It's all very good, but it essentially bypasses the need for MFA a lot of the time, and it can be really, really impactful if those tokens get stolen and used within their time to live.
Yeah, that's a big one now. I think everyone needs to look out for that. Well, sadly, we run out of time for today. A big thank you for everyone that has taken the time to tune in. We hope you found this session informative. We have published our Q4 2023 threat landscape report on the Kroll website. So if you want to get into more details of the trends that we talked about today with Laurie and George, please have a read of the report. The link is also in the chat. So if you like this webinar, there's a condensed version weekly. The Kroll CTI team discusses weekly current trends in our, I'm sorry about my dog, holy cow. The Kroll CTI team discusses weekly current trends on our briefing. It's called In the Trenches, which is published on Tuesdays on LinkedIn. Have a listen, really, it really helps you mature your security and learn about the hot topics that we're discussing and we're seeing that Kroll's taken in on a daily basis. Also, when you leave the briefing, you'll be directed to a short survey. If you could spare a few moments, we greatly appreciate if you could tell us your thoughts on the session. This really helps us gear towards the next sessions and for future sessions after that. Once again, thanks a lot for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we hope to see you again at one of our future briefings. Take care and thank you.